Welcome, California, to the national competition. We're pleased to see you here. We look forward to hearing from you. My name is Dan Taubman, and I'm a senior judge on the Colorado Court of Appeals in Denver, Colorado.
I'm Dave Adler. I'm president of the Alturas Institute and also adjunct professor of law at University of Idaho. It's always a pleasure to interact with Oregon teams. You bring a fine tradition, and the reality is that you've made it to this level despite very difficult and adverse circumstances. Congratulations on your achievement.
I'm Donald Rogers. I teach history at Central Connecticut State University in Connecticut. I've been involved in We the People for many years, and I know, particularly in Oregon, I mean, the competitiveness of that program and what it takes to make it to the national finals. And so I really do give you hearty congratulations for making this far and not letting minor inconveniences like the coronavirus or our technological challenges to get in your way. So I look forward to hearing your comments.
So, and I owe you all an apology. I think I misspoke and said you were from California, but I know you're from Oregon, so welcome. As you know, we're going to do question 3, which I will now read. Then we'll
have the students introduce themselves.
Oh, okay. Would you please introduce yourselves and also tell us about one thing that you were doing before the coronavirus started?
Good morning, judges. My name is Danica, and we are Unit 4, which studies how the principles embodied in the Constitution shape American institutions and practices. One thing I was doing before the COVID-19 pandemic start was taking walks around my neighborhood. Unfortunately, that's been changed a bit because of the pandemic.
Hello, my name is Jack. One thing I was doing before the coronavirus was going boxing at my local boxing gym.
Hi, I'm Allison. One thing I was doing before coronavirus was CrossFit, but all the gyms are closed now.
Greetings, my name is Calvin. One thing I was doing before the coronavirus was go to the park and play basketball.
Hi, I'm Isabel. One thing I was doing before coronavirus was I was playing soccer.
Good morning, I'm Abraham, and one thing I was doing before the coronavirus was going to do football workouts with my football team, but that obviously can't happen. And we would like to thank our coaches, teacher, and of course you, the judges, for being here this morning.
Thank you. Would you like to introduce your teacher, please?
Yes, our teacher is Mr. McGee-Jenks.
Okay, thank you. Welcome again. Let me read the question to you, and as I was saying before, then we'll hear your opening statement and have a chance to ask you some questions, and then conclude with some feedback. Article 1, Section 4 of the Constitution provides that state legislatures can determine the time, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives, yet gives Congress the power to make or alter such regulations. What are the advantages and disadvantages of a uniform election process? What responsibility do state legislatures, state election officials, and citizens have in maintaining free and fair elections? What are the advantages and disadvantages of the trustee and delegate theories of representation as they apply to congressional districts? You may begin.
Given America's ongoing history of state-driven voter suppression, threats of cyber interferences by foreign nations, and current challenges posed by COVID-19, I believe that Congress should use its Article 1, Section 4 powers to create a more uniform election process.
The 15th, 19th, and 26th Amendments demonstrate the power of expanding the franchise at the federal level through constitutional change. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 and its reauthorizations showed that federal legislation can do the same.
A uniform election process would also benefit election security. Despite threats of foreign interference, states lack the resources to implement much-needed security reform. With a uniform approach, Congress could fund and coordinate a coherent strategy.
Recent court battles in Wisconsin also demonstrate a need for federal legislation, such as that sponsored by Senators Klobuchar and Wyden, to provide national vote-by-mail standards when emergencies such as COVID-19 inhibit the ability of voters to go to the polls.
I disagree with my colleagues. Uniform election procedures would dissipate the state's abilities to act as laboratories of democracy. Felon-free enfranchisement, vote by mail, and automatic registration all originated with the states. Further, states are best situated to ensure differing procedures meet the differing needs of their citizens.
State legislatures, election officials, and voters all play a role in maintaining free and fair elections. Article 1, Section 4 empowers state legislatures to set the time, place, and manner of elections. They can also pass legislation to facilitate voting. For example, 22 states require that employees receive paid leave to vote.
State election officials set rules for voter registration, manage the polls and absentee voting, enforce campaign finance rules, and resolve election disputes, such as in Bush v. Gore.
Citizens can maintain free and fair elections through civic participation and through engaging fellow voters through organizations such as the League of Women Voters. They can also organize to protect and expand the right to vote, as was done in the civil rights and women's suffrage movements. Finally, they can volunteer, as polling places require over 900,000 citizen volunteers to function.
Citizens can also protect the franchise through ballot initiatives. For example, through ballot initiatives, 21 states have created independent redistricting commissions to address gerrymandering.
Federalist 10, as well as John Stuart Mill, describe a trustee theory of representation, where leaders, whose wisdom may best discern the true interests of their country, were trusted to determine what is best for the common good, regardless of whether it represented the will of their constituents.
This approach can lead to bipartisan compromise in the protection of constitutional principles, even if unpopular. For example, Senator Manchin voted to remove President Trump after the impeachment trial, despite the president's 61% approval rating in his state.
However, Federalist 62 argues that this theory may lead representatives to forget their obligations to their constituents and become unfaithful to their important trust. In a recent Gallup poll, only 22% of Americans approve of Congress's job performance. Some attribute this crisis in confidence to the failure of representatives to adequately advocate for their everyday voter concerns.
The delegate theory argues that elected officials look to the views of their constituents when making decisions. This gives voters a clear voice in government. The primary disadvantages are that elected officials can act rashly and appeal only to the majority or their own party, leaving other voters and the common good overlooked.
Now, more than ever, at a time of national emergency, the American people require the leadership of Congress to ensure that voters' voices are heard and the right to vote is protected. Whether they will rise to the challenge is yet to be seen. Thank you. We are ready for your questions.
Thank you for your very comprehensive opening statement. I'd like to start by asking you if you could amplify your mention of the Voting Rights Act and let us know what other federal legislation has been enacted that deals with voting rights.
Another example of federal legislation enacted to deal with voting rights is Section 203 of the Voting Rights Act, which really mandates that states must require bilingual ballots and multilingual voting material for people who may not speak English.
Another example of this is the voting amendments, which includes the 15th, 19th, 24th, and 26th amendments, which all expanded the right to vote to minorities and eliminated racist barriers in place, keeping minorities from voting.
Excuse me, I was not asking about constitutional amendments, but about federal statutes that have been enacted. So are there any other statutes that you haven't mentioned yet that you'd like to note for us?
Yes, the Help America Vote Act and the American Disabilities Act were all crucial pieces of congressional legislation that helped expand voter registration as well as target voter turnout for the community of people with disabilities.
You mentioned the fact that Congress can regulate elections, the time, place, and manner of elections to serve the interests and protect voter rights. which groups, racial, demographic, otherwise, would you identify as groups that over time have been disenfranchised and required regulation by Congress?
Almost every single minority besides white men who owned property had to gain the right to franchise. One of the earliest example is through the 15th Amendment, where African Americans gained the right to vote, and then women were enfranchised during the 19th Amendment.
In the modern day, I believe that the primary group that needs help with enfranchising is low-income minorities who often struggle with voter ID laws to obtain proper documentation and photo IDs in order to vote. According to the Brennan Center, 11% of the American population does not have the funds necessary to pay for photo IDs, as they cost between $75 and $175.
I think it's another group of people that should be re-enfranchised are felons. Florida's Congress passed Amendment 4 in their constitution, re-enfranchising over 1.4 million felons in 2018. And there are so many other states where so many felons are not being able to vote even after they complete their parole or probation. And this is something that is keeping so many Americans from the voting booths.
You've explained in many ways why there's a compelling case to be made that Congress should intervene more to streamline elections on the state level. What's holding Congress back? What are the obstacles for congressional action under Article 1, Section 4?
I think one very, very big obstacle is President Trump. President Trump has made it very, very clear that he doesn't want legislation relating to especially vote by mail or the expansion of voting to happen. And so it's going to be very, very hard for Congress to do anything with him and his power to veto in Article 1.
Additionally, I think that the delegate theory is extremely prevalent in Congress today, making gridlock very prevalent and making it very hard to pass any bills, not just voting rights bills. The delegate theory means that it's prevalent today because many legislators are very scared about being primaried rather than winning a general election. This means that they have to be very far to the left or right of their party in order to stay elected and stay with their voter concerns.
Our actions of the
Another
court.
barrier is, Another barrier is deciding what sort of action should be taken. Many Democratic senators such as Kamala Harris, Amy Klobuchar, and Ron Wyden have proposed national vote-by-mail legislation. However, many Republicans believe that a vote-by-mail system would disproportionately hurt Republican voters and lead to Democrats taking the Senate in 2020.
Have the courts been an obstacle for Congress to take any more action?
I don't believe that the courts have really been an obstacle. If anything, they have placed it in Congress's hands to protect voting rights. After Shelby County v. Holder, where the court struck down Section 4B of the Voting Rights Act, which contained a pre-clearance formula to determine which states needed pre-clearance before changing their Voting Rights Act, Justice Roberts really placed it within Congress to implement a new voting formula, but they failed to do so. So I think the action is largely in Congress's hands, not the courts.
I agree with my colleague.
Another example of this is Rucci v. Common Cause, where the court ruled that partisan gerrymandering was a political question. By choosing not to rule on it, they placed it in the hands of Congress and state legislatures, allowing them to solve the issue.
You talked in answering questions about mail-in voting proposals. Do you think that there's a difference between Congress's authority to pass mail-in voting legislation now because of the coronavirus pandemic, or could Congress have done that a year or so ago?
That's time.
I would have loved to have heard your answers to the question, but we'll have to leave it at that. Thank you very much, all of you, for an excellent presentation. You covered a lot of ground, and I think you showed a really excellent understanding of all parts of the question. I was pleased to see you mention the 15th, 19th, and 26th amendments in your opening statement. One thing that you mentioned that I don't think we've heard mentioned or discussed by other teams yet is the role of citizens in terms of ensuring that they're free and fair elections. And you not only mentioned that, but you had a number of good examples or suggestions of how citizens could promote free and fair elections. I liked your mention of the Help America Vote Act and the ADA as other examples of federal legislation. You might have mentioned the Motor Voter Act, which is another federal law that has been passed to promote voter voting. And I also was pleased to see that you mentioned the issue of among discriminated groups, felons, because that's something else that we haven't heard from other teams yet. So I was glad to see that. And finally, I was glad to see you mention the Rucho case, which showed a good understanding of recent Supreme Court cases. So now I'll turn it over to my colleagues for their comments.
Well, I agree with Judge Taubman's evaluation of your presentation. I think it was terrific. I was particularly happy to see your sophisticated, mature grasp, not only of constitutional issues and their application, but also your sense of politics. The realism you brought, for example, to bear in discussing the potential for Congress to regulate state elections. And when you move to the issue of ballot by mail, I was delighted to hear you state that President Trump, who's opposed to it, could in fact stop that very method of voting. And so that tells me that not only are you comfortable with the principles and that you grasp them, but you're able to weave them in and out of your answers very, very nicely. I also appreciated another point, not one that we've not heard yet, and that is the way you link the 10th Amendment to John Stuart Mill and also the trustee theory of delegation, and drew the conclusion that that indeed does promote bipartisan compromise. Again, more evidence of your sophisticated understanding of how these different models apply to American politics. I could go on and offer more praise, and I would be happy to, but I'll stop here and say, a job well done.
I agree with my colleagues that you did a very good job with this question. You were very systematic from the beginning on touching on each parts of the question and responding to them with very compelling evidence. I mean, you know the constitutional amendments, you know about much of the legislation, if not all of it. I especially agree with my colleague David Adler about the real world impact that the sort of trustee and delegate theories have in the workings of the electoral process. Very, very sensitive to the importance of that issue. I thought your response to my question was very, very effective, and there are places where you probably could have refined some of the nuances. Why doesn't Congress act more? You said, well, one reason is because of President Trump, who will veto, a direct mail legislation. And that might have been an occasion for you to say, well, the president is part of the legislative process, and the fact to either sign or veto legislation. On Shelby, I thought the answer was very good, that Justice Roberts did leave the door open for Congress to act. I might have wanted to heard a little bit more about what were the grounds that Justice Roberts used to strike down Section 4B and what that says about Congress's power. But those are nuances, and it was a very, very sophisticated presentation, and one that I wish we had another half an hour to talk about. So very, very well done. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's show our appreciation to all of the students and their teacher and those who've helped them. Thank you again for your presentation this morning.
Good luck.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good luck too.
Thank you.
Feedback.